I'm Dave Kahn, and I graduated from Lowell Tech, in '58, and I was the second class to graduate. We were all guinea pigs because the MIT professor over to start the course, and we were guinea pigs. We had more math than math majors. We had more physics and things, and our laboratory was just about existent. I remember, the old General Radio amplifiers and the vacuum tubes and stuff like that. But anyway, we did learn an awful lot about circuit theory and vector analysis and chemistry, which I didn't really like too much, but anyway, and all that stuff. And our to do with and we also, learned a little bit about nuclear physics because we were talking about electrons, obviously. So we learned a little bit about that, and that was my that's my educational background. I went to school afterwards, to do engineering management and stuff like that. And anyway, after working for the government contracts for years, I wanted to get into the nuclear power business for one reason and one reason only. In the mid 70s, nuclear power was exploding all over the place. And that was good, and it was also bad. I left Sylvania and went to work for Stoner & Webster in downtown Boston, an architect engineering firm that designs and builds fossil power plants, and they started to do nuclear power plants. And looking back on this system, I'm going to give you a summary of my talk, is that, well, first of all, we were like explorers. We were just like the guys in space. The first time doing it, but we did realize that radiation was a silent killer. You couldn't see it. And believe it or not, in those days, safety was number one in everybody's mind. But in that particular area, in that particular time, adherence to specifications and standards, wasn't the corporate executive, the CEO's main theme. They were out to make money, and they didn't care how they made money. So when nuclear came along, that really put a big forced a big change in the utility business, whether it be gas or electric. It really didn't have any professional engineering principles in their business. They did, but not very much. Now to get going. The first slide talks about the history of nuclear development. And the key points is that Hyman Rickover, I consider the father of it. And his management principles were such that, you adhered to well-defined specs and standards. And if you were going to deviate, the deviation wasn't to cut corners, but you wanted to make sure that what you were doing, was safe. The guys in quality assurance, Deming and Joran, they were. You can see in the slide that Deming was the one who went to Japan to teach quality assurance and quality control and statistical analysis and all kinds of math, to huge manufacturing plants. And every CEO in Japan went and listened to Deming, and the results were that the Japanese cars outsold American cars because they were better made. Didn't like it, but it's true. Because I remember as a kid, the spacing between the doors and the cars it varied from a 1/16 of an inch to almost a half an inch. It was ridiculous. But anyway, I didn't know it, but now I know why. Next slide is, well, Deming, yeah, I just put that on. Schuhart was he's the physicist, and he's called the father of statistical quality control. I don't think I need to go into that. We're all probably aware of it. But I will say this is a footnote. When I was studying engineering, I didn't take statistics until graduate school. Never. Number 3. the significant points of interest. Oh, Steve, can I move that? You are sharing the screen. Can I move that green thing out of the way? How do I do that? Steve?
David,
it looks fine
to everybody else. I don't think it's a problem. It's only you.
Oh, it's only me? Yeah. Well, because then I got to move this. Then I got to move my slide up and down. Because I'm reading it as I go along.
On the share.
Yeah. But anyway, in the 70s, there were limited resources, as you can see. There were very few people around. We were really, as I said, pioneering explorers going into a challenging field. But at the time, we had no clue. And you can see the last paragraph that the federal government, the feds, their first priority was really safety. Thank God they had the common sense, to take Rickover's management style and apply it as best they could. However, again, it was actually, I experienced it, working with management that's so far away from the technical field in real life, they really didn't understand it at all, but we went through it. Okay, now what are the forms of energy? By the way, I designed this particular this subject. I was going to give a 5-week, an hour and a half class at a local school, but they stopped the whole thing. And so I rearranged it to make it, like an hour and a half talk. So if it's stuff there that's very simple, that's the reason. But anyway, we get mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, energy, electrical energy, and radiant energy. And these are the types of energy that we're going to talk about. Nuclear energy, Charlie, I can't remember the man's last name, but the physicist, when I was listening to his talk on the Manhattan Project, he really brought it home, because nuclear energy, the energy is stored in the center of the nucleus of an atom, and it's absolutely amazing, a number of energy, how much energy is really there. I'm not going to go into all that, but atoms are split to produce steam. The steam turns the turbine, and the turbine produces a magnetic field, which in turn creates electricity. Now, getting into the nuclear part of it, there's the two types of nuclear power plants: the boiling water reactor and the pressurized water reactor. And we all know that when you put water under pressure, it doesn't boil at 212. It boils at a lot higher temperature. And with the boiling water reactor, I don't recall we ever really made those, because if you want to know the truth, I wouldn't want to work in a power plant that has radioactive water flowing through those pipes. That's just ridiculous. But the pressurized water reactor is much safer, where you get two different cooling channels. And the other thing that comes up in the piping system is, I don't know how many you guys are software engineers, but I don't know how do you predict the reliability of pipe? What you're really talking about is the reliability of materials that the pipe is made out of, how it reacts, to radiation. The first loop of water, the water is heated to a very high temperature in the reactor, and it goes to a steam generator. And that's where what I call radioactive steam goes through the plant. And the second loop carries the heat energy of steam to the turbines, and etc. So basically what we have here is what I call one giant tea kettle, and you get different systems that generate, that supply heat to the kettle to get that pressure. To make the turbine turn to generate electrical power. Then the third loop is the cooling loop. Those cooling towers, they're humongous. As a matter of fact, the fiber optics is used to go in there and clean all the tubes. I mean, without fiber optics, you can never, maintain the coils to keep that water flowing through. So I'm not going to bore you with all the details because I think it's very simple. But the 3 loops, their purpose is really to keep the reactor within the temperature range, and one loop never mixes with the other. Completely good. I'm not going to show you the video clip because unless you want to see it, but I couldn't get it to work on this when I was on Zoom. Now the interesting part here is the fuel pellets. They're about a half an inch long. They go into a cylinder, and then they're into rods. And if you see the picture on the right, there's a man standing there, and you can see how high the fuel rods are. Can you see that? Yeah, and to me, I can appreciate it because I never did see a nuclear plant when I worked there, but I did go to a fossil plant, and I'll tell you the truth, the size of the pipes there are scary. It's now I know why they call them pipe fitters instead of plumbers. So this is the inside of the core reactor where the fission takes place, and each fuel assembly, has the control rods going up and down in it. Those are your. Now for the pressurized water reactor, the steam to run the turbine is produced in the steam generator. And the steam generator you can see is right next to the reactor. So that way there, you don't have as much radioactive water flowing through the plant. And see that diagram, which is key. Now, I'm not going to go into fusion. My friend Charles did a very good job on there, and this is all I'm going to talk about, is that's the opposite of fission. And the only thing that I did want to mention, you see that letters ITER in France. They have the tokamak, I think they call it, that the fusion facility. Have you guys heard about that? But yeah. The purpose of my talk was, safety and what nuclear power is doing today. And ITER is completely opposite in one sense. Here we're trying to, as I go on to the more technical part of the reactor, we're trying to make the reactor small enough so you can take it and put it into a small factory and it'll be plug and play. Try to do that with the fusion system, it's impossible right now. So we're just beginning to make it, we're not shrinking it. I don't know if Charles is here or not, but this is almost the same thing that he talked about and what fusion is all about. And it's really cool stuff. And then, what is radiation protection? Well, it's time, shielding, and distance. And in the electronics field, the only radiation that I worried about was RF radiation, getting too close to the radars and power densities and all that stuff. But that's a different story. If you stand in front of a 10 kMc microwave antenna, you might get cooked because that's what your microwave is made out of. I think it's an X-band radar. All right, then we have the non-ionizing radiation, which is low energy, and it's stuff we use in our cell phones and TVs, etc. But the ionizing radiation is the high energy stuff, and that's the stuff that will change your genetic makeup, basically, from an atomic point of view. Oh, yeah. And believe it or not, we are always we're always surrounded by radiation. It's continual, and I think everybody knows that, And I was surprised that even the bricks are radiating stuff. That to me, I thought was quite interesting. But it's at a low level. At least we can live to a ripe old age and it won't kill us most of the time. All right, now I'm getting into the interesting part of the physics. some of the elements, some of the atomic makeup are unstable, and these unstable combinations are more likely to change. And although atoms are small, it was pointed out last week that it is the strongest force known in nature. And I don't know if any of you guys ever watched the Science Channel on TV, but they were talking about two neutron stars that were circling each other, and they collided and they blew up out in space. Well, I look at the atom as the micro energy, and those two stars way out there in the universe somewhere as macro energy. But they're kind of related in the sense that everything is spinning around and moving around. It's just a thought. All right, everybody remember this from school? That's one of the, it helps you. This was what what brought some of the scientists to realize that nuclear energy is and became a possibility. I'm not going to go too much into this. I'm just going to bring it out and show you that, the details of what's going on here. Now, to get electricity to the customers, that's an interesting situation. You got all kinds of power plants across the country, and we've all seen the power lines. However, some of the transmission mathematics that are involved are very related to microwaves, because I remember, the standing waves, etc., that we studied in school. You use similar principles here to get the power, to a house. But anyway, from an electrical engineering point of view, it's straightforward, wired across a great distance to a local distribution station, and right to our houses. Now, I don't know if you guys ever talked about or even read about the NRC and the NEC, the Nuclear Commission. In the 70s, the way the AEC and the NRC were operating, it was obvious that if you're in charge of it and then you're also regulating it, you can get away with murder. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going to call it the Federal Nuclear Organization changed the way it did to the Department of Energy. They wanted to separate the guys who are promoting it versus the guys who are designing it, and have it broken down so that there's absolute, well, not absolute, but at least you get better management control over the management of the whole system from the design concept right to building and what I call production. It's really not production, but to delivery. And when I was at Stoner Webster, the only people that were really doing any R&D were the individual companies that made nuclear reactors. And I don't think there were that many. If there were 3 or 4, we were lucky. And the technology for handling it, processing it, and making it so you can handle it without getting killed, and just being safety, to have safety all around, it just didn't exist in a logical manner. It does now. I think this is probably a good time to bring up a situation where we had some incidences in does everybody remember in Pennsylvania, the 3 Mile Island, where they had the incident? I can put my light on so I can read this. In Middletown, Pennsylvania, loss of coolant and partial core meltdown in 1979. I was amazed when I read the report of what was going on. You heard me talk and yak about, safety and safety and safety. Everybody was safety. And I kept picking on the United States CEOs, the companies. They're more worried about the bottom line. That was the time when, and this I can say truthfully, is that very, very high executive people in the Department of Defense did not have any respect for the people who ran these companies. Why? Because they had their business administration, they had the MBA, and all they cared about was the bottom line. The universities weren't teaching them that the bottom line isn't just a number. It has some meaning to it, a lot of meaning to it. And I'm not going to go anymore because I think most of you understand what I'm getting at, because after you build a thing, you deliver it, and then you spent a fortune on your guarantees, on repairing it. Now, let me go back. Oh, I'll tell you one other thing too that was quite interesting. In the early 70s, if you guys want to do a Google search on nuclear power incidences, there's quite a long list, and they happened just after from World War II when the Army, DOD was working on it, until the Navy got involved. We were lucky. And I realized that even when I was working at Thorium Reactors, that we were lucky because some of these small nuclear plants that were run by the Army, they had some extremely close calls. So nuclear safety was there, but yet it wasn't there. And the other thing, the 3 Mile Island, I really want to get to is the people who were trained to run that particular plant. They were trained improperly, number one. Number two, there's a big change of, well, number two, I'll get to the point. The control room was not prioritized. Now, I don't know if you've ever been into a control room. I haven't, but I've seen them. And, they showed pictures of the one in the Pilgrim when it got decommissioned. That control room is big. Well, they kind of added about maybe doubled its size when you put nuclear controls in there. There was no prioritization, no computers, no nothing. All the alarms in 3 Mile Island went off simultaneously. Now, how many of us could work in a building or a room the way you had probably bells, whistles, and stuff? It's bad enough when the fire alarm goes off. I don't know how the hell they even stood it. But that was one of the major causes of the incident in 3 Mile Island. Fortunately, they finally stopped. Oh, and the other thing too, I'm going to bring up now in the engineering field, especially in the power field, the public relations was absolutely zero. Zilch. The reason again, I told you I went to work for Thorium Reactors because I wanted to learn about safety. They had safety. We had redundant systems. It was almost like overkill. We convinced the people who were managing those programs that you wanted them to be safe. You didn't want any liabilities. The people in 3 Mile Island, they checked out for us the hard way 80% of all the redundant safety systems that were designed into the standard nuclear power plant of the day. I don't know, why in God's world didn't they say something about it? Because, living here in Andover, You know, I'm not too far from the Seabrook and, you know, in other places. People would come to my house and say, well, nuclear power was safe. I didn't throw them out. I came in and I sat them down for 5 minutes and I just told them what I told you, but in a lot more detail because you know, I had, yeah, my memory was, you know, it wasn't so long ago at that time, and explained to them. And then they realized they were just getting the half truth about what nuclear power safety is all about. The people who were working at it, like people like Stoner Webster and other large architect engineering firms, you know, East Coast, West Coast, whatever you want to, we were all doing the same thing. We were all following the rules. And that's why Stoner Webster and these companies wanted to hire people that worked in DOD. DOD knew about quality, knew about reliability, knew about statistics, you know, and safety. I mean, God forbid if you're working on a weapon, you don't want that damn weapon to blow up in your face. You know, you want to operate it and manage it safely, especially your rockets. Now we're getting, remember I told you about the ITER in Paris, in France. Trying to look at, we've got several different types of advanced nuclear reactors, you know, small, medium, and large. And the small ones are the ones I was talking about. You know, can you imagine bringing it down to, you know, some of the old mills in our area? The goal is maybe to reduce the number of power lines you need going across the country. How many of you guys have been in a test mode? Probably everybody, right? Whether it's software or hardware or what, in the test mode. This is a proposed versatile test reactor. Now I'm coming up to the stuff that you guys who are software engineers are really going to like, because the next thing is, how do you do modeling and simulation of nuclear reactions and their control and management, et cetera, et cetera. That's what the Department of Energy is trying to do. And what it's really called is, well, they're the Advanced Computer Tech Team. And, you know, they're trying to get computing involved so that they can do simulation, you know, carbon capture simulation, for instance. I never heard of that. This is a good challenge for the software engineers. There is now a consortium for the advanced simulated of light water reactors. And I'm just doing a few, and even the old fuel cell coming around. But anyway, I think some of us are just at the beginning of using software, if you will, you know, to model and simulate the various processes involved in generating nuclear power. What they're actually doing is they're working to, just to summarize it, to license this particular product of simulating small nuclear reactors. I mean, I'd like to see it myself. And the reason why I say that is before I retired from Air Force Base, one of the last project I worked on was the modeling and simulation of a Air Force operations center. And that's where data comes in. There's a target over there, you want to shoot them, and what's the best way to do it and all this stuff. You know, it's almost instantaneous. You know, you can model and simulate all these scenarios and then execute them and stuff like that. And I can tell you this without going too far, that same type of activity is going on in Korea, you know, in North and South Korea, especially in the, you know, to keep the U.S. and allied troops prepared for any stupid thing that the guy upstairs there might, think of. So we're prepared. Oh, by the way, there was one thing that I will say about nuclear power that I'm a little bit ticked off at is down in Georgia, they get, the DOE has some programs going on down there, but not up here in New England. And it's called the Voctle, VOGTLE system, and they're using the latest technologies to build several, power plants, using advanced technologies. But anyway, as I was doing this talk, besides the technological advancements that were made, there are some side issues that I don't know if anybody's really ever thought of. Because I know yesterday I was thinking about my experience with nuclear power, and also how, quality assurance and quality control. If you were a quality engineer, you were a pain in the ass. So, and the attitude changed. So what occurred to me was two things. The electrical, the power generation, fossil power generation systems, those companies were so old, and I call them old Yankee style management. It works, don't rock the boat, let's go. Money was cheap, everything was relatively inexpensive. So the 10 or 12 weeks a year, they would close down a generating facility and overhaul it and fix it. Now in DOD, that's unheard of. You want your stuff, if you had a scheduled maintenance program for various parts of your systems so that it never shut down, so you had 7/24 availability. The electrical power industry didn't have that. As a matter of fact, when the Middle East had issues and the power and the cost of oil jumped up because they shut down production, the price of electricity skyrocketed. Well, that kind of ticked me off, because when I was taking engineering management courses for graduates, the accountants have a retained earnings column that I learned about, and that means, you're making money, you put money aside, for future investments, or for, not for a rainy day per se, but just for future investments. Well, the power industry didn't do that. They just kept spending money foolishly. So when everything hit the fan and the price of oil went up, your electric bill went up considerably. And I mentioned that to some of the guys on the website when I was working, and they got mad at me. But then they realized that I was right, because the companies that they were associated with, not, the utilities, they didn't think like that. They were just trying to make money, and that was it. They really didn't think about that. And where a good engineer, wants to do things efficiently, you want to do it and do it right. But that's when I found out that the culture of the time was just like that. And the same thing actually happened to the Navy during when the Thresher went down. Everybody thought it was the nuclear reactor problem. It was not. The submariners have their own way of doing things, especially, and if you ever watched the World War II, movies, there were valves that were designed all over the place, so that the leak came, you went into the valve and you shut it off. All right. With a nuclear submarine, there was one big difference, that when you have nuclear power and you have safety requirements on there, And if there's a leak somewhere that affects the flow of the water going through the reactor, the reactor is going to shut down. Well, that's exactly what happened. And I saw on the Science Channel about a year or so ago the situation that led to the Thresher's demise. The documentation showed that there were a certain type of valve was giving the company issues, and they fixed those issues to the best of their ability, and they knew about it, right? And that's fine. However, one little point of human engineering got overlooked, that God forbid if something did happen to one of the cooling lines to a nuclear reactor, the nuclear reactor will shut down. When the reactor shut down, they had absolutely no power, no backup power to stabilize that submarine that kept sinking and sinking and sinking. And that's what killed them. And I think now that there is a backup power, a backup system, so that it will never happen again. And the reason why I was very concerned about it is I had an older cousin that used to work for Rickover, and he helped design that nuclear reactor. And that nuclear reactor, there were no incidences at all during its design, development, and operation, except it did do the right thing when a leak was detected. It shut down as it's supposed to do. All right. So the people who designed the submarine didn't take that into consideration during, for some reason or other. But anyway, that's the story. If you think about it, the culture of the submariners and the culture of a different culture of the U.S. manufacturers at the time, they wanted to get the stuff out the door. They wanted to make money. And since money was cheap, they really didn't spend money to increase their bottom line, like doing statistical analysis on their production lines to increase the yield, stuff like that. And also for their, when you buy a car, you get a warranty, for your warranty expenses. The attitude wasn't for that. There was always time and money to go back and fix a problem. And that would obviously hurt the bottom line. So it was the type of culture that the nuclear energy program was born into, if you will. And I was just thinking about those two things. We were very lucky; nobody got killed, from a civilian point of view. However, in the Navy, up in Portsmouth, that was terrible. So just a thought, about how culture can affect what happens. Now, keep on going here. The challenges and initiatives, right now. One of the problems is the stockpiles of used nuclear fuel and then high-level waste. And then the establishment, and then enhancing the accident tolerance of the existing fleet. The events that in Fukushima in Japan, if we hadn't designed, if the community, the worldwide hadn't designed those safety systems, and if they weren't incorporated in Japan, things would have been a lot worse. It would have been really bad. It was bad enough as it is. So thank God they had those systems, and nobody ever thought about something going down 12 feet, What they learned from Japan is if you're in an area where you can have tsunamis and earthquakes, you have your auxiliary power stations or systems somewhere else. The design of the fuel, which is really amazing, is that it's going to be more tolerable. Remember in the old days we had vacuum tubes, and the vacuum tubes really didn't care if the voltage changed plus or minus maybe 5 or 10%, you know. But when you went into solid state, power supplies, especially the big ones, you know, 1%, you know, I remember going into a meeting and all these high level engineers were talking, how do we measure precisely 1 volt? And I mean precisely. We had to they got the National Bureau of Standards, and you didn't have to worry about that when we had vacuum tubes. Well, I just thought it was amazing. We really didn't have half the stuff that we need today to manufacture the fuel cells so that they can live over a long range of their environment can be broadened, you know, so the safety, so you don't have to have a safety issue or something going on. So the fuel will work safely within a wider range of temperature ranges or certain atmospheric conditions. That was the object of the Department of the nuclear group at DOE. So that's because what the goal is they want to use or extend the life of these nuclear facilities by doubling them. And how do you do that? Well, you design long-lasting fuel, or you design a system where you can change the fuel relatively easy, and the other systems to make sure that they, you know, that their age isn't deteriorating safety. That's really the goal of what they're trying to do here. But here you can see establishing objectives, advanced modeling and simulation. Oh yeah, the 5 things that you should know about accident-tolerant fuels. That's what I'm really trying to talk about. You know, so like with 3 Mile Island, when the cooling system broke down, you know, it gives you a little bit more time to fix it. Anyway, accident-tolerant fuels, you know, withstand extreme heat for longer than the current systems. They could potentially use roughly 30% of fuel. Accident would improve plant performance. And 3 US companies, the DOE and the national labs, are currently testing such fuels. And these accident-tolerant fuels should be around maybe about 5 years, which is great. You know, so you figure from in the mid-70s, wow, it's a long time. But I guess the nuclear business, the nuclear engineering field, I think is really becoming more mature, just as, you know, software has become more mature and electronics has become more mature. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there that we can be grateful for. And I think that's the end of my talk. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I asked a question on chat and I got a lot of wise guy answers. Has it been decided where the spent nuclear rods are going to be placed, since Yucca Mountain was determined to be a sacred burial ground?
I don't know. That I don't know. But what I will say though is, if you really want to find some interesting stuff on there, is you know, I'm such an old guy, and you know, you think that my wife used to say, engineers think linear, L-I-N-E. You know, they think in a linear sense. Well, so did I. I was dumb enough to look up NRC. Well, NRC doesn't exist. The AEC doesn't exist. It all goes into the Department of Energy, you know, where you get gasoline and oil. And because I always thought of nuclear, well, I don't know why, but anyway, the Department of Energy really took the personnel from the NRC and the AEC, and also people, you know, from the Manhattan Project that are still alive. And, you know, they come out with a handbook, the DOE handbook 1132-99, which is something similar to what I had to use when I worked at Stone and Webster in the quality engineering compliance division. You know, So, because like it was like a program office to make sure that our contractor, was doing the right things. Oh, and one of those items which I was going to talk about was the environmental impact statement. That is one big thing, and I think the greatest gift that nuclear power gave us is that any project now, whether it's nuclear or not, you do an impact statement. It may be costly, but it's worth it. But when the guy was doing the impact statement for the nuclear power plant, he had all kinds of soil and all kinds of other stuff. And I went up and asked him, I said, what kind of an engineer are you? I said, because I never saw an engineer working with soil or any stuff like that. Oh, I'm a civil engineer. And he said, civil engineering, believe it or not, does get a little bit, working about the ground and the sand, and stuff like that. But he had to work on the sex life of the animals that live underground, and how radiation would affect them. So that's how deep they went for the, for the impact plan. And it's I think it's a good thing that happened.
Hey, Jerry, according to Dr. Google, the spent nuclear fuels in the United States are mostly stored on site.
Yeah.
So, well, you can't do that forever.
Well, maybe you can, but it's not going to be safe.
When you have a 50,000-year half-life, I don't think that's the grand plan.
If I might jump in, what they're working on is vitrification, or turning it into a form of glass. Not the kind of glass that you would have in a window pane, but something much more durable. That could probably even be dumped in the ocean.
Like everything else.
Except that it won't react with anything in the ocean.
No, that's still a big problem. Because,
oh, it is.
Yeah, because the reason that the Yucca thing fell apart was because of the senators from Nevada. Yucca is a mountain in Nevada. It's near the Nevada test site. And it's fairly stable from a point of view of earthquakes and so forth. That was the reason it was going to be put there, perhaps. Another place was in southeastern New Mexico, near Carlsbad, same sort of thing. There were a lot of caves there where they were going to store this. But the problem is that you're putting this waste material into some sort of a form that holds it for a while, either barrels, or if you vitrify, you have a glass around it, but that eventually deteriorates. And when I say eventually, maybe thousands of years, but it eventually deteriorates. That's the problem in trying to figure out where to put this stuff, because nobody wants to really solve the problem of where to put it and to store it, where it will stay there and not deteriorate in 1,000 years or so. That's what they work on, and that everybody throws their hands up at it.
Yeah,
I think Charlie's response, while tongue-in-cheek, is probably along the lines of the right thing to do. Until you find some vehicle to get legislatures to spend some time and effort with this problem and decide what they want to do about it, nothing's going to happen, because it's all going to be NIMBY. Not in my backyard. I don't want it here. I don't want it there. I don't want it, we can't have it here, blah, blah.
yeah. And in terms of the future, it's better not to generate so much high-level nuclear waste in the first place. There are now technologies that wouldn't do that. For example, thorium reactors.
I was
Yeah,
going to
that's
ask a question about that.
My grandkids will see that.
Yeah, what are these accident-tolerant fuels? What's the fissional material that's in these accident fuels? Do you know? Is it thorium?
We had a speaker about 2 years ago who talked about nuclear power plants. And Carl Lazarus, if you're still on the line, do you remember any of the details she gave?
I don't see Carl.
He was there before.
There he is.
He's there. He needs to unmute though.
Yeah. Yes.
I do remember her talk. I don't think she spoke about accident-tolerant fuels, though.
No, because
And
this is a
I
new.
don't know what they are.
But she did talk about reactors that burn up a much higher percentage of fuel, so that the amount of residual problem that has to be dealt with is much, much smaller.
Yes.
And I
So
think those were French reactors.
yes. So essentially, you could burn up a higher proportion if you use a faster neutrons, which has its own set of problems, but that's something that sort of got partially developed and then was stopped by the U.S. government. You know, so fast reactors. The other thing is the idea of the molten salt reactor, which there's a little bit of research on, but the amount that's being spent on sort of advanced nuclear research is really a pitifully small amount.
Mhm.
Yeah, about those fast reactors, many of them relied on plutonium, which can be weaponized. And so that got the kibosh.
Yeah, I was going to point out that another constraint on the whole business is to not produce bomb weapons grade material.
And again, thorium seems to be less prone to that.
Yes.
But one of the problems with thorium is, I mean, this goes back 50 years for me, but one of the problems with thorium was that it wasn't as efficient as uranium-235. Is that correct, or have they solved the problem with that?
The efficiency problems are being worked on. That's one of the things Bill Gates is investing heavily in. So the reactors aren't quite ready, but they are coming very close.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Right. That's why, if you remember when I said this test reactor, the proposed versatile test reactor, the VTR, this is one of the purposes of that is to work with the materials involved to try to minimize this headache of what do you do with the nuclear waste. You know, that's just one item, but that's why, you know, the modeling and simulation and stuff like that, maybe you can, you know, put these tools together and start you know, M&S processing. Because I know in my readings, I mean, I didn't realize how much I forgot, you know, from you know, from the early 70s.
It's a perfect storm. It's both a technical problem and a political problem.
Yes,
Right.
yes, and it's also a cultural problem too, because when I related the you know, when I saw that business about the Thresher submarine, about it didn't sink because of because of a fault on the nuclear reactor, you know, and then the close calls that we had, you know, in commercial power plant generation, 3 Mile Island and one in Japan. It's all, you know, it was just cultural, you know, except the one in Japan. I don't think it should have been built in that particular spot anyway, because they knew about tsunamis and they had some protection, but thank God they had the nuclear systems to keep that nuclear reactor from doing more damage than it did.
You know, speaking of the politics of it, some years ago, some protesters went up to Seabrook and they cut the fence and they went inside and marched around with their signs. There were 3,000 of them. And the New Hampshire police arrested them, brought them to a baseball field, and the judge arraigned the 3,000 as a group. And he said he would release each one of them on $50 personally on each for $50 of personal recognizance. And the protesters said, the 3,000 said, we don't have any money. What's for lunch?
Oh, brother.
And the judge said, get out of here. And that was the end of it.
Yeah.
That once for lunch reminds me of the protests in Chicago in the '68 conventions with all the sandwiches.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about what do you do with nuclear waste, but bring that down to something much more simple, like what do you do with recycled plastic? And as we learned, maybe 3-4 years ago, that places like China are no longer willing to buy it and bury it. And we can't even find a place, I mean, other than the ocean, to throw all of that stuff away. And obviously nuclear waste is a lot more complicated.
But the
Well, the other thing is,
the physical volume of nuclear waste is much smaller.
well, the other thing is the bulk of our energy today comes from burning carbon. And what happens to waste there? It all just goes into the atmosphere. You know, you can't even address technologically how to keep that out of the atmosphere, how to keep it out of the environment.
But then
And,
if it stays from the atmosphere and lands on the planet and doesn't do any damage to anybody, if it was nuclear.
Well, it raises all the carbon content, carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere.
Steve, lung disease is a problem.
It is?
Jerry might be able to spend a few minutes talking about
I don't
that.
think that's a problem.
It kept you employed for a number of years.
Yeah, right. I don't see the problem with that.
You know,
Yeah.
talking about nuclear issues, I don't know if I've sent this out. I don't remember. There was a great HBO series on Chernobyl that talked about what happened there and the work that was done to mitigate that to the extent that it was. It was really well done, and I understand that it's technically accurate.
John, Peter, John asked about showing that one, and during our meetings maybe a year or so ago, and I had seen that series, and I come from a background working with nuclear weapons, and I had to teach radiation biology, radiation physics, so forth. That series, it's 5 episodes, and it is extremely well done, particularly from an engineering standpoint and from what happened and why it happened. However, my negative review of it is because of what it does, how it portrays the effects of radiation on people. The biological effects is horribly done, totally inaccurate, totally bad. And what it does is it leaves the impression that this is what happens when you have radiation and biological materials, you know, together, what happens to people. That is bad. However, you're right. The first episode, the last episode in particular, are really good. And if you watch the whole thing, it's well done, extremely well done from a dramatic point of view. And I would say that people should watch if they can. It is on HBO.
And a lot of it really has to do with the politics of the situation. It's not unlike this pandemic.
Yes.
In the sense that when it started, everybody denied that it happened because they didn't want the embarrassment. And by the time they realized that this was something that they had totally lost control of, it was too late to do almost anything. And in the second or third episode, when they bring in a bunch of coal miners to try to dig underneath the plant, it's really a fascinating thing to watch, and you need a strong stomach.
Dave, I have a question. You talked about initially when they started the nuclear power plants that they were very conscious of safety, but didn't over the period of time their threshold change for employees that were exposed to any possible negative effects of radiation? For example, the inspectors.
Yeah, I think you had to wear those those decimeter, what we call them, those dose meters on there. At least at Stoner Webster, you know, and the people I worked with, everybody from the top down was safety conscious, because there were incidences that were never talked about, you know, in fossil plants, where, you know, an aging pipe sprung a hairline leak, and some worker happened to just walk by at the wrong time, and that high pressure steam just cut them up. He killed them instantaneously, you know. But that never happened in a nuclear plant. So they were safety conscious, and the added safety came actually from fear of the radiation itself, you know. Because
What was the accident at 3 Mile Island? What was the nature of that accident?
That was a cooling a valve, I think, broke down or something happened, and the nuclear reactor was getting hot, and all they had to do was just add more cooling, change the cooling flow. But two things that were really detrimental was the people were trained wrong, and the warning systems were not prioritized. So you didn't know which one to do first.
Sounds a lot like what happened to Columbia Gas in the Merrimack Valley.
That's true. That's where I was astounded. Literally.
The
You know?
reason I bring this up, Dave, is because my brother-in-law worked as an inspector at Plymouth for that plant, and in his 30s, and he contracted leukemia and died of leukemia. And I do recall vaguely that over the period of time that he worked there, he did wear a badge, but they did keep changing the threshold of exposure that you could have.
Oh, that's crazy. When they start, I quit.
Now that's just a myth. It's believed that there is no threshold.
Mm.
Yeah. So, I mean, who knows? Nobody really ever figured it out. It's not like a lot of people were dying of leukemia. So.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but medically, the effects of low-level radiation were not really studied as much at first as they were more recently. And
weren't
so a
studied
lot
at
more.
all. Well, when they first started fooling with radiation, they weren't studied at all.
Right. I am aware of the incident at Oak Ridge where two people right out in the open brought two pieces of uranium together. It went critical and they both ended up dying.
Wait a minute.
For chronic exposure, there was no monitoring.
Hold it. There's a lot of myths that go on about this stuff. There was, because I got into the field back in the early 60s. There was a lot of work done about the biological effects and what thresholds could be. And I agree with Jerry that there is no threshold, but what happens is you take a statistical sample and you try to figure out what is the best we can hope for without many people, or maybe 1 in 10 million dying from it.
Right.
And that's where the thresholds were generated to begin with, and they keep changing, and that's true. But that's true of anything that you go into. That's what's going on with COVID right now. How to figure all this stuff out.
Example was something discussed in Feynman's book, and if I understand it correctly, Feynman recognized there was a problem with some things that were too much uranium too close. He noticed it, they didn't realize it, and it was separated. I don't believe that what you described of people dying at Oak Ridge actually happened.
It did happen. It did happen. It did happen. It was at Los Alamos laboratories that it happened.
Yeah, it was slump.
There was a guy trying to put two pieces of uranium close together, and he was an engineer. He had worked on this for years and months anyway, and he was putting this stuff together, and all of a sudden it went super critical for a flash, and that's what killed him. But he's the only one I know of that was killed by that kind of a reaction. Other people have been killed by radioactive materials. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of the things that you're talking about putting these two objects together, one person at Los Alamos in the 1940s.
That's right. I never meant to imply there were others.
Now, if you remember,
I think there were other
Road
in
Institute?
Idaho. I think in the Idaho facility.
No, what happened in Idaho, my dad worked for Argonne National Labs at the time that the Idaho incident happened. What happened was the reactor was being experimented with to see what would happen as you lowered the amount of coolant below what it was supposed to be. And eventually they spewed a bunch of radioactive water all over the place. That was the worst they did.
If you remember the man from the Broad Institute, he talked about the genome and that there's the coding part, and then he talked about the other parts of the genome, which he called it the dark matter of the genome. So there's a lot of pairs that we don't know what they do. A lot of code in the genome. We don't know what the function of it is. But most mutations are harmless. So when somebody mentions statistical probabilities, what you're doing with radiation is you're getting a certain number of mutations per dose of radiation, most of which are harmless. except the one that hits, except for the bullseye, the others are harmless. And that's a statistical probability. And that's, and so somebody mentioned, so we're looking, so what's the statistical probability of a low dose of radiation causing a fatal mutation? And that's the issue that they deal with. And, it depends whether it's a dose on you or a dose on me.
So our
Charlie,
cells,
what were you trying to say? Charlie Holbrook?
our cells have DNA repair mechanisms, and evolution has created a fine balance between, if there were no mutations, then humans would never have evolved. In fact, nothing would have evolved from the earliest cells. So there has to be a certain rate of mutation, and on the other hand, too big a rate of mutation causes all sorts of problems. So we have a finely evolved mechanism to do just the right amount of repair, and that deals with a low level of radiation that's all around us naturally. So it's not that, that there's, it's true that there's sort of no real threshold, but below a certain level, our cells mostly deal with it.
Mostly, but those are the reproductive cells. We're talking about the rest of the cells. They don't need mutations.
Do you know what are the 5 rams that the Navy is using per year, or a quarter, 1.25 rams per quarter, actually? Where did that come from? How was it developed?
Well, again, it comes from the same place. People are trying to figure out how much the population can tolerate without having deleterious biological effects. And it's, as Jerry and I have been talking about, it's all statistics. And you can't say for certain anything about whether anybody's going to die or not. You just try to lower the probabilities. That's where that comes from, and that has changed. That the REM, RAD, Röntgen, all of those units have been used interchangeably, and they are to a great extent the same. It's what the agencies come up with, and it is a good. It's well reasoned from a scientific standpoint, but it's not perfect. And another point is we are constantly having mutations in all our cells all the time. And the repair mechanisms are also working all the time on all cells, somatic or germ cells.
However, the military mind will be not how harmful is it, but rather how many men can we afford to lose?
No, they didn't. No, that's not true. That is not true.
Not like a battle?
No way. No, they were talking about anybody, civilians or military.
Right.
Granted that military could tolerate more.
Yeah.
That is true. That those numbers were more for the military. So I was subjected. I could supposedly take more than the average civilian, but they did take that into account. This was done in the 1950s when this was all being proposed. It was part of what the AEC did at the time when the AEC was set up. They were very concerned about this because there was a lot of problems that went on when the bomb was built with radiation effects. So this was being studied back in the 40s and 50s and 60s and afterwards.
Dick, did they also take into account the time of exposure at that time?
To some extent, yes. Oh yeah, time is very important.
Time, distance, and
I
children.
I don't hear that variable talked about as much as the direct exposure.
For example, babies, children, and so forth are supposed to get much less exposure than adults, and that's been baked into the numbers also. So yes.
When you work in a lab, you wear those little badges, and that takes time into account.
Yeah, the badges well, they're always, it's gamma rays or photons that they're measuring. And it used to be on photographic film. Now it's on other kinds of solid state devices and materials. Usually you wore those badges, depended. It could be a day, it could be a week, 2 weeks or something like that, came out. They were only measuring photons. They were not measuring alpha particles or beta particles.
Right.
So if you were exposed to that, those films never picked that up. Now, what happens in reactors is, I think Sydney was talking about, there's other materials that get into the atmosphere. And in the case of your brother-in-law, I would be hesitant to say there was radiation that caused the leukemia. It could be, but I'd be hesitant to say so. But there's a higher probability that people are going to be exposed to this kinds of radiation when you're working with these materials. So that's.
So that could be where time would be more significant
Yes,
variable.
he's exposed a lot more often. It's just like COVID virus. It's the same sort of analysis that you put in. How many of these particles are we being exposed to? When, for how long? How long do they stick in our body before we expel them? Do we build up an immunity to them?